Welcome, everyone. We are back in the task force on the implementation of the Pupil Weighting Factors report on Thursday, August 12th. We are going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about pre-K. In the Pupil Weighting Factors report, pre-K weights are not really addressed, but there are pre-K weights. And so we wanted to do our due diligence and open up the Pandora's box a little bit while being aware that we can actually close it again. We want to.
Sure.
or not, but just right now we're opening it. It is so fun to see all of the wonderful people on the screen and to have you here in person, Miranda, and thank you very much. We are going to start off hearing from Kate Rogers and Miranda Gray from the Agency of Education and the Agency of Human Services Child Development Division. They submitted testimony that you can find on our committee webpage. If you want to read along while you're listening, I personally find that overstimulating, but everyone else is welcome to do it. And I believe that Kate Rogers is going to start us off today. Thank you. And if you could, even though your name's on the screen, if you could introduce yourself for the record, that would be great.
All right, yes, thank you, everyone. I appreciate, and Miranda, of course, I'm glad she's in the room with you. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with the task force regarding universal pre-K in Vermont and what it does mean and how we operate in terms of counting children and actually school districts paying tuition for children in private pre-K programs. So it is a complicated, as we all know, process, and it's very difficult to put all the straws in one's baskets and totally understand what it means. So I'm hoping to support the task force and Miranda and I to just clear those weeds a little bit if we can, so that it will inform you as you make decisions and recommendations and supporting your report later on at the end of the year, this year. So
before you launch in, if you don't mind introducing yourself for the record,
yeah,
that would be.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to do that. Kate Rogers, I am the Early Education Programs Manager within the Student Supports Division at the Agency of Education. And I've been in this position since about 2005 now. And prior to that, I worked in the school districts as early childhood special education coordinator and as a pre-K coordinator within the districts for about 10 years. And Miranda, would you mind?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Is that good? Okay, so for the record, my name is Miranda Gray. I'm the interim deputy commissioner for the Child Development Division, and I've been with the division for about 5 months, almost 6.
Okay, so we were asked to give a brief overview of universal pre-K. So of course, we're going to start, and in our testimony describes a brief legislation summary of Act 166. Act 166 is our universal pre-K law, and we also have a set of state regulations that have been approved by the State Board of Education that came into being on around November of 2015. So since that time, we've implemented UPK across the state. And I'll show you enrollment figures as we move forward and seeing the trajectory of children accessing programs across the state, which would be in private and public pre-K programs. So Act 166 requires that school districts offer the provision of 10 hours of pre-K education per week for 35 weeks out of the school year to all resident 3, 4, and 5-year-olds who are not yet enrolled in kindergarten. And they must offer that, and they offer it in a variety of ways. And I can I'm going to scroll down here so I need to read some of my notes in order to keep this organized for you with your testimony, that if you're looking at it as well. So Act 166 also calls for the state to establish a UPK monitoring system between the agencies. So this is joint agency oversight of universal pre-K, as well as evaluation and monitoring of private and public pre-K programs. So we have done that. We work together hand in hand pretty much every day. And that's why we thought it was important for Miranda and I both to present jointly today, to show that there is cooperation between the agencies, and we are working toward making that as effective and efficient as possible to support all of the private and public pre-K programs across the state. So our pre-K monitoring system is lovingly called Universal Pre-K Accountability and Continuous Improvement System in Vermont. And under the Race to the Top grant, Early Learning Challenge grant, we worked with a contractor to support the design and recommendations of our UPK access system, which is in place today. It was launched in January of 2019. I was able to present to legislatures at that time about what the UPK access system entailed and the requirements that universal pre-K programs must comply with in order to maintain their pre-qualification status as a pre-K program across the state. So that happened, and then COVID hit. So the spring, of course, we had closures given the pandemic. And so we launched the UPK access system softly then. And it's really hasn't been fully ramped up until the beginning of this school year. And now we're moving forward with that. So you know that is in place, and we are working across agency to ensure compliance with our pre-K programs for Act 166 requirements. So the basics of Act 166 are that beginning in the fall of 2016, school districts were mandated to offer publicly funded pre-K to resident families who voluntarily enroll their child in pre-qualified public or private pre-K programs. So families have the choice. It's the mandate of the schools to offer this in a variety of ways, but it's still the family's choice if they participate as a pre-K within a pre-K program for their child. So all children 3, 4, and 5-year-olds by the date of the established district of residence for kindergarten eligibility, and who are not yet enrolled in kindergarten have access to publicly funded pre-K. Families receive a minimum of the 10 hours a week for the 35 weeks, as I stated before, that is offered through their school of residence. And we'll get into that a little bit to see kind of what that looks like and how that functions. The publicly funded pre-K may be provided through school districts within pre-qualified public school operated pre-K classrooms or pre-qualified private child care programs that include center-based and family child care homes. And within that category, Head Start is within those private center categories as well. Pre-K education is publicly funded, as I said before, through the resident school districts. And this year, the statewide tuition rate is $3,536. And that is an annual rate that fluctuates. It has continually risen over the past 5 years to support children who attend private pre-K programs. Or they may, if the parents choose, they may be attending another public school district classroom in another district, whereas the district would support those monies to support that child across the districts. All right, so the cost of pre-kindergarten is based on and is put in the school's budget and is of course approved by the district voters. So again, this is, if you know education funding, which I'm assuming that everybody is well aware of most of that, but again, it does get confusing. But all of a school district's budget, pre-K through 12th grade and on, is budgeted by the districts prior to, and then needs to go, of course, for approval by our taxpayers within that community. Okay, so criteria for pre-K education programs. There's about 11 different requirements that private and public pre-K programs must comply with. And in order to be considered to be pre-qualified as a state pre-K program, we have approximately 403 public and private pre-K programs across the state as of today. And that fluctuates every week because we have programs who are continuing to apply for to be qualified, and those that may close or other circumstances, they may volunteer to drop out of being a public and private pre-K program. So we have on our website a list of current public and private pre-K programs that is updated. If not once a month, it's updated at least twice a month. And our pre-K coordinator, who is Wendy Scott, is actually in charge of making sure that list is up to date.
Can I interrupt you for a second? I'm sorry.
Sure.
I
can't see who's speaking.
Oh, sorry. This is Rep. Kornheiser, and I'm sorry that you can't see any of our gestures or faces. It makes this a little bit awkward. I'm just sort of a disembodied voice to you. Given the limited time we have and sort of the focus that we have on really the cost of education and the tax rates related to that with regards to sort of the pre-K weeks, I wonder if we could jump into the fray a little bit with further down in your presentation where you talk about statewide expenditures on pre-K and sort of getting much more into your perspectives on how much pre-K is costing the districts and if that is in fact equivalent to sort of half a student in your eyes, you know, whether the weights actually make sense to you for the way that pre-K is being delivered and if the costs match up with the estimations you've been making. Is
right.
that, sorry to sort of, okay.
I can jump into that. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to recommend any specific thing to the task force. As you know, coming from the Agency of Ed, that would have to come from Dan French or our finance directors. And I could certainly ask them to do that. What I can share with you is what we know so far in terms of how pre-K and how pre-K weighting has been done for a number of years and what expenditure costs look like from the districts. I do want to point out before I go there though, is that in our testimony, Miranda and I have put enrollment figures. And there is actually a link to our enrollment dashboard that the Agency of Education has, and it's really good to go into that dashboard and really start to look to see what these numbers are looking like. Enrollment from beginning in 2014, and we can certainly go further back, but prior to Act 166, enrollment in what we called pre-K at that point in time under Act 62 was about 6,200 children. As we passed Act 166, partial implementation happened in 15 and 16, and those numbers increased to 7,300. full implementation, we saw a huge jump in enrollment, children accessing pre-K education within those public and private pre-K programs. It almost hit 9,000 children. Then in 17-18, we had a little bit of plateauing, a little drop off in those numbers. But then in 18-19, that number rose once again. So when we started really looking at the enrollment numbers, we had an increase of almost 2,700 students in the first few years of universal pre-K. As we moved into 2019 and 20, we started to see the impact in enrollment because of the pandemic, and we saw a drop in enrollment. In 2020-21, this school year, we had a significant drop in enrollment, and it went down to 6,670 some odd children. So that was a decrease in over 2,200 children enrolled. And that's going to be a significant factor in school districts' census and when it ends up with their ADM counts and looking at equalized pupil weighting, which is, of course, the 0.46, as we all know, for pre-K students. So I just wanted to point that out. That is a significant decrease. There was also, so you're aware, decreases in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. And we are assuming that those reduction in enrollment had to do with, there was an increase in homeschooling efforts across the state by a lot of families for each of those grades. Homeschooling is still high this year as well as we moved into the new school year. So again, the enrollment figures are and will impact the school district census and end up with their equalized pupil count and what that looks like across the grade levels as well. Okay, so I can hop down in my notes to pre-K student weighting. So the pre-K students weight is and always has been less than 1. And it is historically and statutorily set at 0.46, which means that the 10 hours per week that a preschool student attends has an average daily membership, so that's an ADM count of 1. Okay, that's just like kindergarten. Okay, however, when we throw in the weighting for purposes of the equalized pupil count and formula that we use, the ADM is then reduced to the 0.46. And again, so as I say to be short, an elementary student is considered the standard weighting. So I had to put that in, that's in the testimony, and has the weight of 1. So there's a significant difference between the kindergarten and pre-K. Not that it's right, not that it's wrong. This is just how it's been. When I looked into the historical pieces to this, school districts were providing pre-K, preschool education that began way back when in the 1970s at Ira Allen in Burlington. And that was to provide an opportunity for children with disabilities to be in a typical classroom with their same age peers. So that is a wonderful philosophy that Vermont has, and that has maintained that we have children with disabilities within a general ed classroom as we move forward. So, but still with this weight of the 0.46. So even those districts were counting, we still weren't the full weight for a pre-K age student, 3, 4, 5-year-old who is not in kindergarten yet. So as we look at school district expenditures. I was only able to obtain expenditures from the school year FY 19 for school year 2018 that went into 19. And those expenditures were significant. In the testimony, you'll see the expenditures from FY 16, 17, 18, and 19 in comparison. You'll see the rates going up, but I want to make sure that the task force knows and is aware that these expenditures are a culmination of services that the district provides for pre-K through 12th grade. So it's very difficult to tease this information out. We should be getting FY20 information, and when we get that, either our finance office will provide it to you or I will forward it to you as well. So you have those numbers, and we hope to get that relatively soon. So you have that prior to making any recommendations and for your report on pre-K weighting. So, so the pre-K enrollments, of course, are based on the census data collected.
I'm going to interrupt you one more time.
Yep.
I'm sorry. And I would have visual signals of my interrupting that would make this feel smoother.
Okay.
I'm sorry. So Senator Hardy has a question.
So
Sure.
I'm looking at your table on pre-K expenditures, and I just want to make sure I understand, because I heard you say that this is based on K-12 expenditures. Is that right? Did I hear that right? Or
So-
is this just pre-K expenses?
So this is pre-K expenses, but when the districts submit the information, the pre-K piece has to be teased out, and it's very difficult to tease that out because when they complete their budgets, it's for the full school budget. It's not just for pre-K. So it would be like teasing out second grade. And we don't do that because the budget is inclusive of all. And these services that, you know, it is inclusive of is direct service, transportation, student support services that includes special education costs. This includes administrative costs, equipment, and supplies. So this is the kind of the full gamut of
Okay,
what the costs are.
in 2018-19, is the per pupil cost for a pre-K student $7,507?
Yes, that's what that means.
Okay, and does that include both the public and the private programs, or just the public programs?
So this is a great question, and this is where things get a little bit confusing. So the school district counts the children in the private who are enrolled in private programs, who have been pre-qualified in their census count. And so if they have, say, 50 children, 25 of them are in their publicly funded classroom, like in the school district, in the school building themselves, and then 25 are in the private programs. We are counting 50 children in our census, and then that goes into the ADM and then the equalized pupil formula and that whole piece. So we're definitely counting all kids. What happens with this is because that cost, the $7,507 per pupil cost, includes not just pre-K direct instruction, it's inclusive of special education, it's inclusive of all those other services. So it costs for a pre-K student to be taught, I'll just use that word, within the school district's programs. That's what the per pupil cost would be. And that, of course, that's different for each of the districts, and this is an aggregate of those numbers. So there is a difference of what per pupil cost is and the tuition rate that is established that private programs receive.
Right, I know that. So
Okay.
I'm just trying to understand if this is including the private programs or just the public programs. This
It includes counting the children because they are all the school district resident students.
So yes.
So yes.
And is this a mean or a median for cost?
I'm not sure. So I have to, yeah, that's a good question. I can get that.
Thank you. And then my other question before moving to Rep. Conlon is, I was quite struck that the pre-K weight includes all EEE students and all pre-K students in sort of separate categories, but are both considered weighted at the same level, which I thought was an interesting way. That is not my experience of education costs in EEE versus, EEE kids versus kids who are in pre-K without EEE services. And so I would be curious about your reflections on, given that all of these weights were put into statute long before we had a universal pre-K program in Vermont, and our EEE services were probably quite different back then and probably less integrated with our CIS services, if you think that these are sort of things that we need to examine further. Question I probably should have warned you about before you got here today. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think anything deserves exploration, to figure out, if we are providing equitable services to all of our pre-K students, including the children with disabilities. And again, I'll have to speak with our secretary, Dan French, because of course, I am answering for the Agency of Ed, and I want to make sure that I won't misspeak as we move forward with this. So I'll just say anything deserves exploration at this time. So thank you.
Just very quickly, would it be fair to say that this average number would go up or down significantly per district based on their percentage who are strict voucher kids and who are in a public program? In other words, if you had 100% pre-K students who were attending private programs on a $3,500 voucher, that per pupil cost would be significantly less in that district, as opposed to the cost of providing a full-time pre-K program within the school system.
If I'm understanding your question right, our pre-K, the 0.46 is based on the 10 hours of pre-K, no matter if it's in a public school or if it's in the private program. So I asked this question to to Brad James the other day, and he said it is the hours that matter for this. So if a district right now is supporting a pre-K student for 20, 25 hours a week, full time, it's still considered one, but then the equalized pupil rating is the 0.46. So it doesn't change if it's public or private. Did I get to the?
No, it's kind of the first that I guess I was really asking if and we don't need to spend much time on this, but just that per student cost that you've averaged here, I assume would differ a lot among districts depending on the percentage of pre-K students who were enrolled privately, in which case the cost is $3,500, versus a school district that might operate a number of full day, 5-day a week pre-K programs.
Yeah, I I want to say, no, that doesn't matter, but I can speak with Brad
fine.
more about that.
Thank you.
Yes. Mhm.
Any other questions? Do you have further testimony that we interrupted you from, or should we hear from Miranda?
Nope, just familiarize, thank you for really looking at the pre-K piece. Do appreciate the opportunity, and I'll shift it over to Miranda.
Thank you very much. I
Thank
really,
you.
actually, before we go to Miranda, Representative Conlon's question about the different costs of delivering pre-K to public or private providers is something that I'd be curious to hear more about at some other point via whatever mode's easiest for you.
Okay, we can certainly look. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will just, knowing that we have others in a short period of time, just let you know that we have referenced, there have been a couple of studies that have been done, one Act 11. So we've pulled out some of the what is working well and then areas for improvement, and also link those two studies if you wanted to review those further, but you don't want to.
Thank you. You're welcome. Really appreciate it. So next up, we have Morgan Crossman and Dora Levinson. Are you two taking turns? Do you have a woven presentation? The mics are yours, however you want to organize yourselves.
Perfect. Thank you all. For the record, I'm Dr. Morgan Crossman. I'm the Executive Director at Building Bright Futures. And Dora, if you want to introduce yourself.
For the record, I'm Dora Levinson. I am the Research and Data Director at Building Bright Futures.
So recognizing that we are almost out of time for the committee today and you have our formal remarks, I just want to take a minute to say that we appreciate the time. And as the mom of a private pre-K student who's also receiving cross-district service provision for special education through speech therapy, I'm glad that we're talking about this. I'm glad that we're talking about the importance of equitable access to service provision for children with disabilities and special healthcare needs. Just quickly, most of you on this call know Building Bright Futures' role in the system, but we do hold the vision and strategic plan for the state of Vermont for the early childhood system, and we serve as Vermont's Early Childhood State Advisory Council. As that state advisory council, we don't directly support or oppose any specific proposal or bill, and our role in this system is really to provide you all with the most up-to-date, high quality and evidence to inform decision making. So our testimony and all of those different compository of information and data is really our way of showing you that there's a lot of information out there on universal pre-K that can help support your decision making. But as you very clearly heard from Kate and Miranda, we as a state haven't really done a great job of evaluating our programs. And there's a lot of data that's still missing that contributes to our ability to actually monitor the impact of these programs. So specifically around pre-K, I want to highlight one of our information gathering efforts. So prior to the pandemic, Building Bright Futures did a statewide information gathering effort to support some of the existing studies like the pre-kindergarten education study and the early care and learning household study to really understand the landscape of pre-K, what's working well, where is there regional variation, and where are there challenges. Specific to your questions around equitable access and cost, we did hear that the cost requirements around universal pre-K does go beyond the ability of providing that high quality care and education. So by law, it can't always be captured under that 0.46 in thinking about tuition. So we're thinking about costs like contracting with licensed teachers, developmental assessments like Teaching Strategies Gold, which happens 2 times a year for students, and some of the administrative tasks that programs and supervisory unions and school districts are facing. And the other thing is that we have challenges for private pre-qualified programs when we're thinking about the management and pay equity. One of the other challenges that I mentioned very briefly at the front end of my testimony is there's a lack of data around Act 166 that really prohibits our ability to truly monitor and evaluate the impact. So we do have a monitoring and evaluation plan, which is so critical to the success of Act 166, but that's different than having a standardized way of monitoring high quality data on the number of students, the slots, the capacity, the outcomes of those students who are actually receiving services. And that is a component, but I think that what we're hearing is that we also have a challenge of documenting the financial impact of UPK in the state of Vermont. So we're really working with our agency leaders to support them in doing that. And I'm pausing for a second because I heard a quick pause. I wasn't sure if someone asked a question.
I don't think so, but I
It may just have, yep,
tuned
it may
in.
just have been feedback on our end. So I want to turn it to Dora really quickly to address a specific question asked by the committee around regional variation in UPK.
So in conversation with Representative Kornheiser, we were asked about regional variation in access. And we did some very preliminary analysis to assist in sort of quantifying this theme of regional variation. We would be happy to work with the Agency of Education and the Child Development Division to do more formal analysis if that would be helpful. But just overall, the capacity of universal pre-K programs varies by county from about 17% to about 51%. So there is, so across the state, perhaps 27% fewer regulated slots than the population of 3 to 4 year olds. Again, very not final analysis. In terms of the split between school-based programs and private pre-qualified programs, there's also a large variability between counties. So some have a school-based proportion of 20% up to 74% in other counties. And again, this is important because while all pre-qualified pre-kindergarten programs have the same requirements, there may be differences in additional benefits, including additional hours and this sort of some of the services that Kate had mentioned that aren't always necessary, that we heard were not always necessarily equitably provided. And I'll just pass it back to Morgan quickly to wrap up.
So I just want to briefly say that although we said that we as a state have challenges with high quality, easily accessible data on pre-K, there is a wealth of information across our early childhood system about the different components of that system. And specifically, we conducted an early childhood needs assessment in 2020 as well. There's an 8-page data gaps table on the things that we as a state feel we need to be able to answer. Very basic questions about, again, enrollment, capacity, slots across a range of different programs. So this is not just specific to pre-K. I also want to draw your attention briefly to Vermont's Early Childhood Resource Data and Policy Center. So Building Bright Futures, as you know, an organization committed to neutrally convening partners, but really serving as evidence and data to inform decision-making, recognize the need to centralize data and information on the early childhood system. So what you found in our testimony document was a range of the different data and resources, as well as publications from both Vermont partners, Building Bright Futures, and national partners on what's happening in pre-K, both in the state of Vermont and across the country. So those links have additional links to all of the partners you heard from today. We work very closely with Kate's team, the Agency of Education's data team, Miranda's team at the Child Development Division, as well as her data teams, and Allie Richards from Let's Grow Kids. So we do have a repository of data on the current status of Vermont's early childhood system and universal pre-K. It's not enough to actually document enough of the impact of what we need to actually know to say, this is the component and this is what's making the biggest impact. And this is what we know about equitable access for children across the system. So I'm happy to answer questions. We are really here to be a partner in this work and to provide data that you're looking for. If you have questions specifically about any of the data, we're happy to make those connections for you. It's also important for you to know about an upcoming initiative that is related to universal pre-kindergarten education, and it impacts all of the partners on the call, which is Vermont's Childcare and Early Childhood Education Systems Analysis. We're calling it Vermont's Early Childhood Systems Analysis, but the goal of that work is to examine the systems that govern and administer childcare and early childhood education in the state of Vermont and use it to make recommendations for how we approach the functionality of our system and actually promote optimal outcomes for children and families in an equitable way. So I'm happy to come back and talk to this committee or others individually about what that looks like, but this is a role that BDF was tasked with through the legislature, through H171, and we are procuring a national contractor to support that effort for the state of Vermont. And lastly, we as a state advisory council do have a range of experts from early childhood education. Many of them are sitting here: Allie Richards, Kate Rogers, Miranda Gray, but also members from the Vermont Principals Association, the School Boards Association, and Act 166 coordinators, if folks are interested in getting more information. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. I just sort of wanted to name when I noticed, Kate, you brought this up and I saw this in one of your charts, the enrollment dip, and just that we passed legislation last year to hold harmless enrollment dips for ADM through the pandemic, and that it's something that we're hyper aware of as we do analysis for the task force, and will likely not be including data during the pandemic for much of the analysis that we're doing, because we know it's such an unstable time for enrollment across schools. Senator Perchlik.
Thank you. Dr. Crossman and Allie, this is going to be a question for you later because it's in your written testimony too. You both say that the 0.46 is not adequate for high quality childcare, but you don't really say how you arrived at that. So like, you know, it's the wrong number, but do you have any idea what the right number is? And how did you determine that it was the wrong number?
So Allie, I'll take it first and then kick it to you. But in our testimony, what we were trying to convey is that we did information gathering across the state to ask partners their perceptions on what was working well and what was not. That 0.46 was something that came up as not working well, but there was not a consensus around what that should look like, the number of hours of pre-K, you know, how that should be rolled out. That to me is the next step of what we as a state need to determine. And I also should say, although that component won't be specifically called out in the systems analysis as the thing we need to fix, I also want to be cognizant of what the Biden administration is going to be presenting as plans for pre-K across the country and what that means for Vermont's early childhood system. So really exciting that Vermont in many ways is leading the way on pre-K and having this universal pre-kindergarten education system. We internally as a state know that there are challenges and that there are things that aren't working. And we're still really far ahead of the rest of the country on a lot of this. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep working on it. We should, but we also just have to be mindful of that national context. And I truly don't think that we across the entire system have the ability to say right now, this is the exact number of hours and this is why.
Thank you.
Allie, we would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you for coming.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. For the record, Allie Richards, CEO of Let's Grow Kids, and I can address Senator Perchlik's question certainly is my testimony. I'm going to zoom us way back up and just make a couple key points and very cognizant of the time. So first of all, thank you really greatly for inviting me here to be a part of the conversation. It means a lot to be among you all with this discussion. And second, thank you for the work, really. Our shared vision is a Vermont where all children, regardless of race and gender, ability, economic background, have equitable access to educational opportunities, and especially early childhood educational opportunities where it all begins. And so we see the work you all are really grappling with here today is doing exactly that by thinking about these recommendations, which truly are working to achieve fairness and equality for Vermont's kids. And so the first thing, the high level point that I must make from Let's Grow Kids is just when we're thinking about equitable opportunities, it really starts with high quality 0 to 5. So as we talk about pre-K services, and as you consider the recommendations in this report, I would just urge you all to remember that the whole 0 to 5 comprehensive system and the great strides we're making together, including H171, are absolutely foundational to this, to being able to set up all these following recommendations to put us on a path for fairness and equity for our kids, starting with a robust birth to 5 system that is very much seamlessly integrated into pre-K through 12 and beyond. So key point, the data is very clear, happy to provide it as needed, but it's very, very just certain that when we do the 0 to 5 investments, it gets to a lot of the goals that you are grappling with here today with this report. Second, getting more to the specifics. It's really, I think, important to say that the 0.46 ADM isn't enough. And great question by Senator Perchlik, and a very nice answer by Dr. Crossman on that with more specifics. Really what I would add to that, and again, is in the written testimony as you referred to, is that we have only done 10 hours of pre-K. So we know that all children need high quality 0 to 5, and most of them need much more than 10 hours a week. And it's not equitable in some cases because many families can't access 10 hours a week. So that zooms down to my other point, which is the mixed delivery system by which we deliver pre-K services in Vermont. It bears repeating as you consider this work. The mixed delivery system has to be front and center because that's how we've done this. That's considered best practice across this nation in the way that we set up 0 to 5 services. But it also really focuses on equity because it allows families to access the pre-K, the 10 hours of pre-K within a more equitable setting that they can actually find. So it's nested, those 10 hours are nested in a much more sort of sustainable other a system that allows basically for a lot of variety and cuts down on those transitions. So it's just really important to keep in mind. I would strongly urge that this study doesn't address the 0.46. So to your question, what I would say is, this is what's next for us. You mentioned opening Pandora's box. Perhaps now is the time to open it. In other words, we need to evaluate with all the partners you see around here and those that you've heard from earlier today as well. We've had a series of sort of small conversations over the years with many different, iterations of this group, some in the legislature and some not. And it's clear that that was a step, and we need to now understand what the next step is. So an evaluation of that 0.46 that you don't really see addressed in this report, I would say we need to open the conversation. The only other point I'd really like to make, and again, I know I'm keeping this very high level by design because I think we need more information, as Dr. Crossman really pointed out too. But evaluation, thinking about that 0.46, we know it just doesn't cover the true cost of high quality pre-K. That's the key, underlying point. And we have many ways we can back that up qualitatively and quantitatively. But as we and you all consider this really important conversation, I think it's absolutely paramount that we also consider it with the timing. We are making strides, as I said, with H171, with investing in a comprehensive 0 to 5 system that pre-K services for 3 and 4-year-olds is a part of. And if we make a change on weighting pupils differently, say for 4-year-olds, for example, a higher ADM than even 3-year-olds, these will have potential unintended consequences on the entire 0 to 5 system. It is not undoable. In fact, I would say we right now are in a really opportunistic time for us to figure this out together because we're making a commitment to figuring out a comprehensive 0 to 5 system. It is within sort of our power, I think, as Vermonters, right now to just align the 0 to 5 work with any work that you do in changing the weight for people, for pre-K pupils. And that's because, again, if you up the weight, say for 4-year-olds for pre-K without timing it properly with the investments that we intend to see here as a state for 0 to 5, it may accidentally kick the fragile 0 to 5 system down at a time where we're just trying to preserve it so that we can go to a much more sustainable model with an equitable, funding system behind it. So fast talker, very sorry. Very open to questions, but very cognizant of the time, and just wanted to make those high level points of, as we hopefully go down this road together, these are some really key things to keep in the back of our heads. Thank you so much for the opportunity and really for opening this conversation up. We'll all be better off for it when we think about these really crucial things that impact equity and fairness for our whole K through 12 and 0 to 5 population. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate, if nothing else comes of this conversation, we've added another sort of layer of work that's happening in parallel to the work we're doing that's going to need to be integrated into any final decisions. And I think all of the Act 170, is it Act 173? It was whatever the bill number was for all of the great work that we did on early childhood last year is going to need to be integrated into these conversations. we have. What?
166.
No, it's not the one I'm talking about.
171.
171, thank you. Okay. It was 57 when it was still in the building, I think. Is that right? Okay, anyway. Anyone have any questions? Cheryl, you good up there? Senator Hooker, excuse me. Okay. Thank you, everyone, early childhood champions. Really appreciate you all being here to have this conversation, and we will follow up, I think, with a lot of details later on. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So with our 15-minute push, we managed to lose Jeff Francis, and it is not our last group's fault on that. We started 15 minutes late because we did public anyway. We shuffled a little bit. We lost Jeff Francis, who was about to testify, but he sent an email, and thank you. You're welcome to.
I didn't want to.
Yes. Because he had a hard stop at 2. And so I am going to read an email from him, and then Saoirse will add that email to the public testimony. Does that work for people? Slightly awkward. Okay. He says, to summarize my testimony. So this is on the issue of how to measure poverty and the idea of using the new form that some of our school districts are already using, instead of using the school meals form in some districts and using the income form in other districts, to move everyone to just using the income form so that we would have standardized measurement across the state. So this is his testimony on that question that I think you asked for, Scott, last time? Someone else.
I don't remember, but yeah, I know it's a question that Representative Till is greatly interested in. Maybe
Great.
it came that, yeah.
So what he said in his email is, to summarize my testimony, BSA believes that poverty counts data need to be improved, and we will pledge to work with other parties to improve collection forms, et cetera. And that if we have more specific questions from there, he's happy to work with his members on it. And to sort of add a finer detail on that, we've had some great conversations with Jeff and then with some other folks who have been implementing some of these alternative forms about how even the existing income form that we're using could be vastly simplified. And the idea of what stakeholders need to be at the table to simplify that form so that districts that don't, because the form right now can be quite complicated, and I don't know how many people remember looking at it last time, but the form can be quite complicated. And so I don't want to create a further inequity by creating a system where the districts that have the capacity to really engage with parents to get all the forms filled out wind up with higher poverty counts than the districts that don't have the capacity to knock on every door and navigate those social relationships to get the paperwork filled out. And so there's a number of stakeholders that are sort of interested in working together to simplify the form, if that's something that we're going to recommend. Does that make sense? Okay. We do have Sue Siglowski back again, and she just miraculously pops up. So lovely how that happens, to add her members' perspective on the issue.
Yes, thank you for having me back again. And you asked me to come in and talk about the poverty weight and also English language learners. So is it okay if I cover both of those now?
Yes, please. And the poverty weight, not necessarily the weight, but how we measure the poverty.
Yes, right. So yes, you asked about how we measure poverty and the possibility of moving to one statewide form, which would be an alternative household income form. The VSBA supports efforts to improve the collection of data related to poverty so that it is more accurate and timely. So that's our response to that question. We also just wanted to let you know that currently 16 VSA section 4010 subsection H requires the secretary to determine the equalized pupil count for the next fiscal year for district review on December 1 of each year, and then to make any necessary corrections by December 15th of each year. And what we've seen is that the Agency of Education changes those equalized pupil numbers for districts well into the spring and sometimes as late as May. And this can be really problematic for school boards to have those numbers changing during and after the time that their budgets are being voted on. So to the extent that the collection of data related to poverty is causing any of that delay in determining equalized pupil counts, improving the collection of that data to address accuracy and timeliness would be a good change. You also asked for our feedback on the current calculation for poverty that includes English language learners not living in poverty. And I don't have any information about the origin of that part of the calculation. And our board didn't feel like it was within their expertise to provide any feedback on that particular question. So that concludes the poverty weight feedback, and I'll move on to English language learners unless there are any questions.
I think not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We understand the task force has questions about whether categorical grants are useful to school boards in conversation with voters about the budgetary needs of the district. And you asked us to comment on that. And the answer to that question is really that categorical grants they're not directly part of education spending that voters are asked to support, because education spending is the total expenditures less offsetting revenues such as categorical grants. And school boards really tend to focus on those areas of the budget that are within education spending when they are speaking with voters about the budgetary needs of the district. Regarding the use of categorical aid in place of the recommended changes in pupil weights, the VSBA supports the use of categorical aid in place of recommended changes in pupil weights only where the study and the study's authors have indicated that such an approach would be an effective alternative way to achieve the goals of the study in terms of providing equitable educational opportunities for students. And I did submit written testimonies. Sorsa, I think, was posting it within the past 20 minutes or so. So that statement that I just read is at the very end of the written testimony, if you have any need to refer to it in the future.
Thank you, because you referenced some statute, and I certainly did not copy down all of those numbers and letters, so I'm glad that we have it in written testimony. Jim's got it though, so good. Yeah.
Thank you. That concludes my testimony.
Thank you very much then. Really appreciate you jumping back in with us to answer those quick questions.
You're welcome.
So folks, before we go into public comments, I think we have two folks lined up for public. We have one person lined up for public comment. Are you the one person lined up for public comment? I was thinking we could have a conversation around some thoughts on ELL and some thoughts on how to measure poverty, and then maybe from there, what folks would want to hear more about from the conversations we had today. So thoughts on the how to measure poverty question.
I'm not averse to trying to determine if there's some better way of doing this. But I wonder if it might not be worth exploring what we already have. Like, we have data from the IRS about average family income and many other things that may already be there, may suit our purpose versus the creation of another system of trying to measure. But if they don't work, I am open to finding a new way, but there might be a way already.
I would agree. The only question I have regarding using IRS data is whether or not it's discrete enough to be able to use any precision based on what we're doing in the school district. My suspicion is that probably it's not going to be precise enough. That said, to use something that exists that you don't have to collect information from individuals, I think is extremely important. If you have people filling out forms, I guarantee you it will be a disaster. The forms won't get filled out right, they won't get filled out completely, and we created yet another burden that we now need to hire somebody to go manage on a district by district basis, which I think is the last thing.
Yeah.
I want to just sort of
Go
a
ahead.
reminder, districts are already collecting either school lunch form data or this universal income data. And so it would just be some districts would swap out one form for another.
Well, it would be great if they could eliminate both
Both
forms.
forms, yes,
Yeah.
that's true, yes.
To Senator Brock's point, which is a good one, when we file in the state, we have to, our school code normally goes on the filing. That information might be readily available from the Department of Taxes.
This question of being able to use IRS data and or Department of Tax data was something that actually the Senate Agriculture's Committee last year discussed, because we were doing work on school lunch eligibility and trying to expand the eligibility by drawing down more federal dollars. And we asked the tax department to work with to work with AHS to see if they could collaborate on this collection of data. And basically what we were told was that the data that the tax department gets is confidential, and there are federal laws about confidentiality. So it would be difficult to cross-reference it down to the school district level, is my recollection. And we can get that testimony or have the tax department, the commissioner, come in and talk about this again. But my recollection was that it was not going to work at the level that we needed it to be able to measure poverty in a school district.
Okay.
But again, this is
Worth
from,
exploring further.
yeah,
And
it's
the
from
question
like a
is
year and a
how
half
to-
ago.
Some information provided it's not.
Can you move your mic closer to your mouth? I'm sorry.
Some tax information can be provided for use in a non-individually identifying way, provided that the number of people involved in the sample is large enough that it can't be divided to be able to point to individuals. So I think it is worth exploring further with the tax department, just to see what, if anything, they can do for us. Just quickly on that issue, we looked at that in Senate Education, and my recollection is that the feds for the school lunch programs requires a separate form, but we should double check that. But on your question, Madam Chair, on poverty, I am still interested in looking at why we're counting the English language learners in the poverty that came up today again. So that's the one thing that I don't know if confused is the right word, but wanting to know more about it, if that's the best way to do that. I sort of understand why they did it, but I'd like to dive into that. I also have a point of order. I didn't know what EEE was. Triple E service.
So special ed services before the age of 5 are, this is like a vast simplification. I'm sorry for any technical experts listening to me, but before the age of 3, birth to 3, it's children's integrated services, which is essentially special ed, but
Right.
different. And then for 3 and 4-year-olds, it's, and I think actually a little bit older, it's triple E. and then it becomes.
What is triple E? Is it stand for something?
It
Early
does.
Essential education.
Really?
Yes.
That's what.
My understanding of the testimony we've heard so far from last time is that no one has any idea why ELL was ever sort of double counted, was counted in the poverty weights if someone wasn't living in poverty. And the closest that Professor Colby could get to imagining what that was is that it wasn't originally a poverty weight, it was originally an at-risk weight. The at-risk weight included English language learners and people who were living in poverty, but that's not how the new analysis figured it.
I mean, it kind of makes sense to me that if they were just trying to do that, they got it in there just to cut it because maybe they knew the weight was wrong. Like, well, let's kind of double count.
It does double count.
Yeah, right. And I don't know, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I have another question.
Yeah, go.
Sort of related, at least related to testimony today. And I think it does talk about it, but I couldn't find it really quick in the study, why we didn't ask them to look at the pre-K weight back when they did the study.
There's the opportunity.
Yeah, it was, correct me if I'm wrong, Kath. We discussed it in our committee. In the original study.
Yeah, like.
Okay, because a lot of pre-K was sort of up in the air. 166 was new, hadn't, a lot was to be sorted out. There's also just a lot of talk about whether 166, what was set up through that was the right way to go. So because I think pre-K was very much still under debate, still up in the air, it was put to the side. And also because it's not really a public school program as much as it is a voucher program.
But yeah, we'll count, and I think your question earlier, we're only counting the 10 hours. We're not counting actual pre-K costs.
I think we got not a 100% certain answer on that.
But that's what it seems.
Before we talk about pre-K, can we, I'm just gonna try to organize the conversation a little bit, if that's okay. So on the how to measure poverty, folks want to look for a new way, sort of want to take a final stop by checking in with tax and hearing from tax if there's any way to get some better data out of that. In that absence, probably switching over to the universal form might be okay, but we'll consider that when we get to tax. So I'm going to put that aside.
Wait, can I add
Yes,
one more thing
yes.
to that? So one conversation that you and I had at some point with, I don't remember who, was this idea that if we were to do a new form, knowing that there are problems with every district's ability to get 100% compliance with a new form, is there a way to do some kind of adjustment to the measure that would at least compare it to, say, the SNAP eligibility or something else? And if it's way off, like if the form says that there's 30% poverty in the school district, but SNAP eligibility looks like there's more like 50% eligibility, is there a way to adjust it without getting too complicated, but just as some kind of measure of understanding that not all parents are going to fill out that form?
Yeah, that was my comment, I think 2 weeks ago, is, I mean, if they know what the uptake percentage is, then just apply it to get a more accurate number than what we have. I mean, that would seem to make all the sense in the world.
Yeah,
If we have both of those numbers.
That's sort of what I'm
Yeah.
talking about, is doing
Yeah.
an adjustment based on other data.
Yeah.
And because sometimes you need to collect data and compare it to other data you collect to get even a more accurate, because every measure is imperfect.
Yeah, they have, it sounds like they have the uptake percentage down to the single digit.
I think that's based on sort of studies every decade that.
Yeah, but,
So, yeah.
right, but it's based
So,
on
yes.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Senator Hooker, are you following us okay and hearing us now that we're leaning back in our chairs a little bit?
I am sort of following. If you could put your mics closer, I could hear it better. But I guess I'm remembering the comments about income and also about school meals and the difficulty in getting families to fill out the forms. So if there's another way of determining what the level of need is and what the poverty level is in districts, we should probably look at that. And I think what Senator Hardy was saying about kind of putting those things together and coming up with a number that incorporates the data that we know would be helpful. So I'm looking at, either making income forms simpler. I don't know how you have families and encourage families to take up the meals, the free and reduced lunch if they're not willing to. So there are all of those things that, have been a problem from the beginning in determining what kind of need there is in each of the districts. And then if you go to the tax department, as Senator Hardy was saying, it's already confidential to try to get that data. Even if we could, how do we apply it to single districts? But those are all questions.
So next question is the ELL being wrapped into the poverty. I'm not saying this, pretend I'm not chairing the meeting, I'm just gonna say, I think we should just toss that idea out because it actually, no one has provided any evidence that it makes any sense to do that whatsoever.
It's kind of insulting.
I mean, it kind of depends on what we do. I would agree, but only with the caveat, it depends on what we do with the weights.
What we do what?
With the weights.
Yes, absolutely. So then the next question is, what else folks need to hear about ELL and ELL weights? Yes.
One thing that came into my mind, and maybe people can educate me on this, is do we have the same issue with identifying ELL as we did with identifying special education? Like, how are we defining that? Are we setting up a potential where schools, so it's like, hey, one of your parents doesn't speak English as their first language, so we're going to put you as an ELL learner. Which kind of over-identification, which we had with special education, at least that's my understanding of where part of that 173 came from. That or other issues with identifying. I don't remember learning how ELLs were identified. And I don't know if that's an issue or not.
That's a great question.
Yeah, so I'm going to go out on a limb here. I thought that I, in all of our readings, saw pretty clear standards for how an ELL student is defined, but I just can't. I was looking back through my notes to find it and I can't. But I remember reading it in all of our stuff.
Yeah,
Oh, that doesn't seem super complicated. So unless we hear otherwise, maybe we need to get clarity on that, but it's somewhere in here.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's a really good point. I don't think that I've heard testimony about over-identification of ELL students, that it is much more cut and dried. But I do remember the ELL director from Brattleboro, I think that's the one who was here, talking about how when they sent out surveys, they were able to identify more students. They were missing some students, and they figured out a way to catch more students. So it was more of an issue of missing students than identifying them, is my impression from the testimony we got.
What I remember her saying is that the more they had staff in schools, because they didn't have a staff in every school in the district. Whenever they went into a new school because of an identified student, they would find other students in that school that had not yet been identified. It's also possible there's over-identification too, but that was one example of under-identification we heard. I am stuck on this idea and of the fact that the district's very high numbers of ELL students have a federal categorical grant, and the districts with very low numbers of ELL students do not have that base categorical grant. And so I know that a lot of our testimony has been painted about this weights versus categorical grant question, and I don't think it's an either or. I think it might be possible to provide a base categorical grant to balance out the fact that some folks have a Fed grant and some folks don't, in order to create like a base level of services for ELL students, especially as Vermont diversifies and we have more schools that are still coming in under that number.
I think that's a good point, because didn't we learn that those schools that don't get the base grant have a higher per pupil cost of ELL because they don't have other infrastructure?
Yeah, one thing you could do is you could turn that on its head and you could just have a categorical grant from the state of Vermont for ELL and then subtract out any federal grant funds that are received. Could do it that way.
And would they still be weighted, or are we talking about moving them into an entirely separate categorical grant system?
I think it's possible to do both simultaneously, but I have not talked to anyone about the math part of that. That's just something that is in my imagination and I'm letting out of my mouth. So that's something that I would want further analysis on. Who else? Are there other questions sitting for that on that for people? Yeah.
I think that I'm just going to say this, knowing that I'm going to get a ton of emails about this now that I'm going to say this out loud. I'm looking at you, Maggie. Is I think that ELL, based on what we have heard and what I know about ELL, my mother was an ESL teacher when I grew up. My kids have been in ELL programs. I know, more than the sort of average white mom in rural Vermont about ELL. I think it makes sense for ELL to be a categorical aid program. And I think it is very parallel to our special education program. It has a federal component, it has a state component, and even more so, it is very concentrated in some 4 or 5 school districts with small numbers in other districts that are not being served right now very well at all. And we can design a categorical aid program similar to what you were just saying, Representative Beck, that really targets those districts in ways to make sure that they have more robust programs and provides accountability and assurances to the state that these students are being served regardless of the kind of district they're in. And we can design, there's this assumption out in the field with some people out in the field that categorical aid grants are a negative thing. They can be designed in so many different ways. And one of the things I've asked Mark to look into is different ways of designing categorical aid programs. We have right now small schools grants, we have education, we have transportation aid. They're all designed differently. They're all different types of the same thing. They're all categorical aid. We can design a categorical aid program that fits the Vermont story of English language learning in our state. And that's what I think we should do, because I think we need to have better accountability in this area. And that's what I've heard from the testimony.
I perhaps have approached thinking about this somewhat similar to Senator Hardy. I had a child who did English language training, an adopted child. And it was very clear from the discussion that I had with my local school district that they didn't know how to do it and weren't really going to do it. Fortunately, I was able to tuition my child to another school district not too far away that was able to do it. And I'm reminded as we talk about this of that situation in which you have a person who drowns in a pond whose average depth is 1.5 feet. You have that same situation, I think, and I think, this is a question I asked at the last meeting, of the child in the Northeast Kingdom where there's one English language learner in the entire school district, to the 11 kids in the district in Addison County who all speak Spanish, to the innumerable language issues in Burlington or Winooski. And all of those are very different. And that average solution just doesn't, I have a hard time wrapping my hand around how that average funding provides any degree of equity or consistency.
Yeah, I just wanted to voice sort of a hesitation, which is that if we're going to go down the road of considering, moving ELL out of the weights and into categorical aid, I would really want to take some extensive testimony, because I'm sure I'm not alone in getting a lot of feedback from folks that categorical aid is less flexible, it comes with more red tape, it's not equitable, and I really would need to think that through before we go down that road, because it's a pretty common feedback that I'm getting from a really broad range of people, and so I think we need to really think about it, hear from a lot of people, and think about the upsides of categorical aid, which seems so easy and clear, versus the downsides that I'm hearing about anyway from a lot of different districts. So I don't know, I'm worried about it.
Thoughts of who you would want to hear from?
Yeah.
Thanks. Senator Pritchett?
Yeah, on that, and I agree with my two Senate colleagues on their comments, basically, but also want to hear more testimony on how we could structure the categorical aid. And I think it's important to note that the small school grant and the transportation are both categorical aid. And if you read the study, and a lot of people say it, just do what the study says, it says, yeah, a lot of people had problems with the small school grant that should probably be addressed, but nobody had any problems with transportation aid. And so there's a way to do categorical aid where everybody's happy with it and says, don't change it. They don't say it as red tape. It's not an inequity. So there's definitely an effort out there to preemptively try to take categorical aid off the table. But it's evident from how we do it that there's ways of doing it that could meet our needs. And so that's the kind of testimony that I'd hope to hear, just how we do that.
Anyone else on the item? Okay. So next question for you all is moving further away from sort of like what are your decision points and more into who else would you want to hear from to come to a decision point on sort of what we talked about today on today's agenda. On EQA. Anyone else that anyone would want to hear from on that?
EQA?
Education quality.
Oh.
Sorry.
I already forgot.
I'm so sorry. I'm just looking down so that you want to follow along. And I'm not saying anyone has to make a decision if you don't name someone today. I just want to know who else might be on your list.
I guess, thinking about the testimony we got today, there are a lot of, sorry, Cheryl, or whoever's listening out there. We got a lot of testimony about sort of the things that are happening. There's the Act 66 process that's happening between the state board and the AOE. There are regulations that are happening right now that are in development about special education, et cetera. I guess it seems to me like what language can we include in our eventual bill that would dovetail with those efforts and ensure that there is a connection between this potential change in the way we fund education and the quality and equity that we want to assure happens because of the change in funding. Because I heard some testimony saying we got to do all of this together, and then some people backed off and are like, oh, just look at the funding. But if we're gonna change our funding system, we need to make sure that there's a connection between funding and accountability and equity and quality. And if we're not doing that, I don't think we're doing our job as policymakers.
We heard reference to Massachusetts a couple of times, and I just wonder if there is somebody who could speak to how they handle quality assurance there.
Emily, I'm still hoping to clarify, who's in charge here and where the responsibility lies as we come down with this, the new weighting system.
Wait, what do you mean by that, Cheryl?
Well, to where for the quality standards and the quality education. When I was listening to the secretary, I was wondering, he talked about the districts having responsibility. And if we're looking at standards, and I know that all of our districts are different, but if we're talking about equitable educational opportunities for all of our kids, I think it rises to a level beyond the districts. And I just would like to know what the agency's responsibility is going to be, along with what happens at the district level. So I don't, I'm not sure really who or what kind of standards we want to look at, where we're going to fall here, whether it's with, certainly with poverty, defining ELL and all of these other aspects that we're dealing with, but who really is going to have the oversight and the authority to implement these changes. I mean, this is our task as a task force, the implementation of the report that's come to us, and who really is going to be in charge of making sure that these things are happening. So I'm still confused as to who's in charge.
Well, ultimately, the state is the entity with which the courts have been very clear. The state is responsible for the free and equitable education for all students.
This is the third time I've said it, but
I like it every time you say it.
I have to say it again, is keep using this word equitable. And it's like when I was in the UK and some person would say cheers and I would interpret it one way and they would interpret it something else in terms of what it means. I'm not sure we're all speaking the same language. What is equity? I think we need to have a very clear definition in what we're doing when we say equity. When we look at the Brigham decision, it means equality of opportunity. It doesn't mean that every kid is going to get the same result on the SAT when they take it. So in some cases, some of our witnesses that have appeared have said, well, it means both. It means equality of opportunity. It also means equality of results. Is that what we intend? I think we need clarity of that because we keep throwing this word around and I don't know what it means depending upon who's saying it.
So who should?
And it really is a driver at what we do and what we wind up and how we do it. To understand that. If we keep saying that we want equity and we all have different definitions of what that means, then we're going to have a mess on our hands.
One thing that Secretary Trump said that actually created a framework inside my mind for this that I found really helpful is that a lot of what we did under Act 46 was try to create equity between schools. And a lot of what we've been talking about, the weighting stuff, I mean, ideally, right? Ideally in Act 46. It's hard that we're talking about Act 46 so much because it's has its own, controversial file. But, and then a lot of what we talk about with the weighting study is equity within schools. And so in addition to getting sort of clear on a definition of, are we talking about inputs or outputs? For me, it's helpful for me to think about, are we talking about equity across schools, or are we talking about equity within schools? And I think we can be doing all of those things, but it is helpful to define. Is there one that you'd want to bring in for testimony, or is that an internal conversation?
Probably a linguist.
You can find one.
But I think that Dan French and the superintendents do have a generally agreed upon idea of what equity is, and which is, it's not equality, it's equity. And I think that if we could get their consensus opinion as to what it is, I think that's probably.
I'd actually like to see a written definition that we apply consistently in what we do. Equity in many ways, just the term in general, means justice. It means treating people fairly and consistently. But it's I see it being morphed in the definitions that are being used here, particularly when it comes to the equality of results. Because that's a very, very different thing than treating people alike. It's very different than applying resources that are equal, which is what we talk about in the Brigham decision, is providing resources that are equal in nature.
Okay, we will.
Yeah, I have some
figure out a way to
ideas.
work on that.
You're absolutely right.
And certainly we would have to define it in the report, and so we might as well define it early enough for it to make a useful conversation. So we're gonna just have Mark do it all by himself.
Well, I think Jim is currently
I was gonna say-
scanning the statutes right now.
That's what I was gonna ask. I mean, it seems to me this must be already determined legally. It seems like a question for Jim, maybe not.
Well, we're not gonna answer it right now, but it's a good question to keep open and close soon. Special education, do folks, just in terms of the conversation about whether, the conversation in the study about whether or not a poverty weight should be applied to the census block grant. I personally heard loud and clear, please don't do anything until we can for a little while. But do people have more, want to hear more on that topic?
Yep.
Yeah, I agree with that thought. I mean, when Peter and I were in that committee, when that went through, and we just wanted that to be explored, whether that was appropriate or not. And at this point, it seems like it's not the appropriate thing to do it. We could address poverty through the through weighting or categorical grant or whatever we end up doing there. But I think we should probably leave 173 alone.
I don't think we need to hear any more testimony, but I don't want to forget about it. So I just want to make sure that in our report, in our plan, that we say, okay, there's more work to be done.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should just let it fly. I mean, my one concern is that was the same argument for pre-K, and that's why they didn't include pre-K in the study. And then now we're like, I'm wishing that pre-K had been part of the study, but I do think it's a little bit different. I think that if we did the weights both in the special education and in the general formula, it would be double counting. So I think leaving it the way it is, it makes more sense, and it makes our work easier too. So it's a win-win.
But we're not concluding that it's, at least I haven't. I think we should address that in the report, like that, like we need to keep an eye on it.
Right.
And maybe even name how the eye will be kept.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
Very strange.
How the eye will be kept.
Senator Hooker, are you? Okay. So, which brings us to the last question I have, is, do people want to hear more on pre-K weights? And I don't want to talk about pre-K weights as a thing we're going to solve right now. Are there clear questions or specific witnesses that you would want?
If there was a witness that had an opinion on how they should be changed, or what do, and maybe the witness is Dr. Colby, of whether she could do a study, like it's possible.
I don't think Professor Colby ever wants to do a study crossing.
Maybe one of our enemies that she wants to suggest this.
I think the challenge with pre-K is, we don't know as a state, there are many advocacies for what pre-K
Right.
should be. Should it be a voucher program that supports private systems? Should it be a fully public program? And so that there are much bigger things to debate here.
Yeah, that is a rabbit hole.
And yeah, I don't want to even go
Yeah.
near the rabbit hole right now. I'm just wondering if anyone have a witness that they want to bring in for that topic.
I'll think about it.
Okay, thank you. Because we are ready to hear from Ms. Mclean and our public comment period. Thank you for humoring us through that conversation.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for your service this summer on this thorny issue. I know it's got multiple levels of complexity. So I wanted to speak just a little bit.
Can you introduce yourself first?
Oh, yeah. My name is Margaret Mclean. I live in Peacham. I have been a Vermont educator for over 40 years. I'm a past employee of the Rural School and Community Trust, a national advocacy organization for rural schools. I worked in rural schools in over 40 states over the 15-year period I worked for them. And I'm currently the executive director of the Vermont Rural Education Collaborative. We're a member organization of 44 public schools, 7 districts, mostly in the Northeast Kingdom, stretching from the border down to the Upper Valley. So I understand you're looking at this issue of categorical grants versus weighting, and for some parts of the study. And I urge you to look at categorical grants in reality, how they're used, how they've changed over time, rather than hypothetically categorical grants weighting. I'm sure you're doing the, this cross-checking, and it seems like apples and oranges. But if you look at how categorical grants have been used over time, you might look at those choices a little differently. So I was a member of a study group back in 1998, which came out of the decision around small schools grants. There's a link in my testimony to that. And at the time, we looked at geographic isolation. There was some metrics around that. But the major purpose of small schools grants was to give some economy of scale to our smaller schools, particularly those small schools which are geographically isolated. Now it's 2021, so a lot of time has passed, and that categorical grant has been given out every year. So this coming year, small schools grants are given out in the following way. If you are a community that merged voluntarily, you receive your small schools grant for your new larger district automatically. It's an entitlement program for those districts. And that's kind of apart from the fact that the point of merger was to create economy of scale. And it could have been argued that the larger district gave economy of scale and the need for small schools grant was no longer necessary. But that was not the decision. So that's one bucket. The other bucket is the bucket of places who could not merge, did not merge, or were forcibly merged. Those communities have to jump through a series of hoops, and after which they may or may not receive their grant. They have to do that by application. So instead of a check that arrives in the mail and is part of what you receive as a school district, there's an annual application, and the application comes after the budgeting process is in process. So there is fiscal pressure on the district they don't know if they're going to get this grant or not. Okay. The quote from Brigham at the time back in the 98 that stuck with me is this: the distribution of a resource as precious as educational opportunity may not have as its determining force the mere fortitude of a child's residence. It requires no particular constitutional expertise to recognize the capriciousness of such a system. So we have double layers of inequity built into this. We have the first 2 buckets based on a decision made by adults 5 or 6 years ago, which is really irrelevant at this point, whether they chose or didn't chose to do something back then. And then we have another group that have to apply, go through hoops, and then may or may not receive the grant based on that. It's inequity baked into the system. When you look more closely at the hoops that districts have to jump through, the state board that developed the hoops were uneasy with what they developed. And at the time they wrote to the legislature and asked for the whole issue to be revisited. There's a link to a draft of that letter. I couldn't find the final letter. That issue has not been revisited. So if you look at those hoops, there are further inequities in the hoops. So there's the first level of inequity in that there's two buckets, depending on where you live and what you did 5 or 6 years ago, you do or do not automatically get this grant. And then the second level of issues to do with how these hoops determine annually if you receive the grant or not. I don't think the system could be more inequitable if the legislature was trying to make it an equitable system. I think it's just blatantly inequitable on its face, and it's compounded by the hoops that districts have to jump through. So that's an example of a grant that started in 98 with a specific purpose to give economy of scale to our small schools, and how it's currently being distributed. It needs to change. The weighting study recommended weighting based on enrollment and weighting based on population density. There are lots of ways you could do this in terms of defining rurality and looking at geography and looking at bus rides. There's lots of ways, but that's the way the study recommended. I urge you to do what the study suggested, to wait for this, not to give a categorical grant, because categorical grants from the experience of a Vermont educator cannot be trusted to over time be used for the purpose they were intended. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. So, no, we are ready, almost ready. We have 11 minutes before 3 o'clock, so I feel pretty awesome about that. Would love to review what we're going to talk about at our next meeting in 2 weeks, and wondering if we want to spend 3 minutes looking out for dates again.
For October.
That's optimistic that we can do it in 3 minutes.
Well, I think after 3 minutes, I might stop.
Okay.
So October. Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. Oh, and maybe we could go off our live stream now, so people don't have to stop. Oh, and the meeting, please. Thank you. No one needs to